Warm welcome to all of you. My name is Sheti Hailu, and I'm a member of the Ethiopian Diaspora for Peace. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the city of Ottawa, Canada, from where I am addressing you, is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Shinabe people. The Algonquin peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial, and I'm grateful for having the privilege of living on this land. We have speakers and participants from Canada, USA, and various countries in Africa and Europe. So I say to you all, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending where you are at. We are grateful to all the speakers and participants for making time to join us. And just a few words about our group. Our group was formed out of the realization of the need to create a safe space for dialogue. We all believe in building sustainable development through a safe dialogue. That's how we came into existence. And so far we have organized 7 discussions on different but related topics on the relevance of history, whether history should chain us to the past or whether it can serve us as a bridge to the future, how hate speech can lead to genocide and how people can recover from it, the rule of law, and the challenge of achieving peace during transition time. So we have had very interesting discussions. The theme of our meeting for today is ethnic federalism and the quest for democracy in Ethiopia. And we are very lucky to have extremely knowledgeable speakers with a wealth of knowledge gained through years of research and practice. I promise you very stimulating and insightful presentations and discussions. Now, a few words of thanks. We are truly indebted to each of our speakers. They are all very busy and highly sought after for their expertise and wisdom by governments and international organizations, and yet they are freely giving us their invaluable knowledge and time. In fact, some of them have also been viciously attacked by groups who wanted to silence voices that didn't echo theirs. Therefore, we admire their courage and dedication to guard their intellectual freedom and continue to present their evidence-based analysis to enrich the dialogue. We would also like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to African Studies Group, Institute of African Studies, and the Group of 78 for facilitating dialogue on issues that are pertinent to Ethiopia and the rest of Africa, issues that are often absent from policy dialogues and from the media. The promotion of this event has also benefited from support from the Institute of African Studies and Africa Study Group. We have managed to attract diverse groups and a large number of attendees as a direct result of their contribution. Before introducing our moderator and passing the mic to him, let me share just a couple of personal experiences that shaped my views towards ethnic politics. The first one is my transition from being a foreign student to a Canadian citizen who enjoys the privileges and the rights as a citizen. When I came here, I was a foreign international student. Within a space of 5 years, I became a citizen. And I do appreciate that. And I compare this with the realities that's happening in Ethiopia. While I and many others do enjoy the freedom that comes with citizenship here, if I go back to Ethiopia, there are people who want to pigeonhole me in a certain ethnic group, as if my identity was shaped, never to change at the time of conception. If my parents are from this ethnic group or that ethnic group, the rest of my experience, the cumulative experience that I have had, has no impact on my identity. So I refuse that. And the other thing is, in the early 1990s, during the referendum, the Quebec referendum, the late Anatole Rappaport wrote a piece to a newsletter for the Group of 78. I don't remember the whole story, but there is one sentence that remained with me, and I'm sure it will stay with me forever. What he said was, as you know, he's a famous mathematician. He said the calculus of exclusion will not end before excluding the excluder. Therefore, any group that thinks it can achieve what it aspires for by excluding other people might end up being on the outside as well. So I refuse to exclude others, and I refuse to be excluded. And now let me introduce our moderator. Professor Blair Rutherford is a professor of anthropology and the chair of the Department of Anthropology and Sociology at Carleton University. And he was also the chair of the Institute of African Studies for 2 consecutive years. And there are many things that I can't say, but he asked me to be as brief as possible. So let me pass it to you, Blair. Thanks so much.
Great, many thanks, Eshete. It's my real pleasure to be the moderator for this talk. As we just heard, this is an extremely important topic. Outside of the current events the tragic events going on in Ethiopia right now, which of course is garnering a lot of attention, this is a topic which has been long discussed and debated in Ethiopia and many other countries. And I'm pleased to have on this panel a real esteemed colleagues and experts, not only in Ethiopia, but also on federalism in Canada. So I'm looking forward to the presentations, and I'm looking forward to what I'm sure will be a very rich conversation in a question and answer period. So I'm going to briefly kind of explain what the format will be, and then we'll start into the presentations themselves. Each speaker will have 15 minutes. I'll kind of appear when it's around 13 minutes just to let speakers know they have a 2-minute warning, and then come at 15 minutes. So we wanted to make sure we have sufficient time to hear all the excellent talks, but also have time for a Q&A period. The question and answer period will happen after all 5 speakers make their presentations. When a speaker is speaking, the rest of us will turn off our cameras and mics, so you can only focus on that specific speaker. I'm unfortunately not an expert on Ethiopia. I've carried out my research in other parts of Africa, so I'm going to apologize in advance if I'm going to mangle any of the names when I'm introducing people. Eshete, kindly try to give me a brief on pronunciation, but I do apologize in advance. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce each speaker before they present. I'll give a very brief bio sketch of them. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, and that's the Honorable Hugh Segal. As for those of you outside of Canada, you may not have know Hugh, though he has a very rich international experience, but he's an exemplary Canadian and scholar and policy practitioner and public figure in the country. He's the Matthews Distinguished Fellow in Public Policy at the School of Policy Studies at Queen's University in Kingston, Canada, as well as Senior Advisor at Aird and Burles in Toronto. He served in the Canadian Senate from 2005 to 2014 and chaired the Foreign Relations and Special Anti-Terrorist Senate Committees, and was previously Chief of Staff to the Canadian Prime Minister and Associate Cabinet Secretary in Ontario. He has written several books on public, foreign, and defense policy, conservative politics, and income security. He is a former member of the Commonwealth Eminent Persons Group, which focused on moderation, human rights, and the rule of law. And now I'll turn it over to the Honorable Hugh Segal.
Thank you, Professor Rutherford and colleagues. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. The unique qualities of Ethiopian federalism, based as they are on respecting different ethnic identities, languages, make it different from the kind of geographic federalism with which Canadians are familiar. Frankly, without a federal system, Canada would never have come into being to begin with. But to be fair, it would be simplistic to argue that our Canadian federalism is only about geography, while Ethiopian federalism is only about language and ethnicity. There is no analysis of value of Canadian federalism, and the British North America Act, which passed the Westminster Parliament in 1867, that made that federalism the basic law of our land, that could credibly argue that the largely Francophone and Catholic nature of Quebec at the time, or the provisions for constitutional protection for Catholic schools at that time in Ontario, or the protection of minority language rights for the English-speaking minority in Quebec, or the Francophone minority in Ontario or New Brunswick had zero to do with ethnicity, language, or religion. The unique nature of Ethiopia means that it has a unique cultural history and federal system. One can say the very same about Canada. The opportunity here, I think, is to pursue how some of the creative approaches to federalism in Canada may provide opportunities that could be of value to Ethiopia and vice versa in the future. Despite the rigid divisions of power designated for both the provincial governments and the provinces in Canada in our Constitution, the truth of the matter is that the different federal governments that were elected over time each had their own brand of federalism, which buffeted the rigidities down from time to time as circumstances required. For example, Prime Minister Pearson, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, who governed between 1963 and 1968, used what he called cooperative federalism to achieve major changes like universal health insurance, the Canada Pension Plan, and federal support for post-secondary education in those three areas that were exclusively provincial jurisdiction. He was the federal prime minister. It's important to understand what instruments he used to actually modify the way in which federalism adapted to existing challenges. He used a term that I think is important in our discussion, asymmetric federalism. He used it to allow different provinces to contribute to the national goals, but to do it in a way that was unique to their own provinces' exigencies, culture, and requirements. For example, as we sit here this afternoon, there is one Canada Pension Plan for all Canadians, unless they live in Quebec. In Quebec, there is the Caisse de dépôt, which is a sovereign investment fund that supports a Quebec pension plan. Asymmetric federalism permits different provinces to do things in their own way as long as the purposes are similar to the broad public interest as defined by the country as a whole. For many years, this applied, by the way, on immigration in Quebec. Quebec always was interested in French-speaking immigrants because they wanted to ensure the survival of French in what is the only French-speaking jurisdiction in all of North America, Central America, and South America. They were allowed to exercise a preference on which immigrants would be admitted to Quebec, and this was always in favor of as many French-speaking immigrants as possible. And to do so became part of our asymmetrical federal system. Other provinces can now express preferences in terms of their economic and social priorities on the issue of immigration. For example, in British Columbia, health insurance requires the residents of that province to pay monthly premiums to the BC health insurance program. In no other Canadian province do provincial residents pay premiums. Health insurance is funded by the public tax resources overall. The other tool used by prime ministers was exemplified by what Mr. Mulroney did between 1984 and 1993. He applied the principle of subsidiarity, asymmetry in one case, subsidiarity in the other, which basically said that important services should be administered by the level of government closest to where the people actually live. That meant that the Mulroney government concluded an agreement with Quebec to move federal manpower and human resource programs under provincial jurisdiction in Quebec's circumstance and at Quebec's request. This does not exist for any other province in Confederation. The Canadian Constitution, as amended in 1983, still has no restriction on something called the federal spending power. And this, along with the asymmetry agreed to by Prime Minister Pearson and the premiers of the provinces, is one of the ways that federal funds collected from all taxpayers nationally are invested every year in universities and healthcare, which are, by the way, exclusively within provincial jurisdiction under the Constitution. Agreements reached between governments, such as for health transfers from Ottawa to the provinces, despite health being a provincial jurisdiction, produce a mesh of linkages which serve the public interest without breaching the principles of the 1867 Constitution. It would be less than honest were I to portray Canadian federalism as without serious gaps or flaws. Unlike the United Kingdom, for example, which is a unitary state, we do not have a national health service. We do not even have a national health system. We have 13 health systems in each of our 13 provinces and territories, who do not talk to each other very much at all, nor do they share statistics on health outcomes in a similar apples to apples way, which would allow some national understanding of different levels of provincial performance in terms of health. Health insurance provisions, for example, differ by province as to the amounts of compensation which physicians and others receive for the procedures that they engage on behalf of patients. As we have seen in the recent pandemic, public health safety measures differed province by province. Clear differences, province by province, in infection rates and death rates ensued. Not, by the way, in and of itself, a good thing for any country. So there is much to be improved in Canadian federalism. Future challenges will encompass the self-governance of First Nations, which were established by constitutional agreement in 1982 and subsequent Supreme Court of Canada decisions. If truth and reconciliation with First Nations in Canada is to be real, constitutional change will ultimately be required, as will an engagement around reparations for lands and resources that were once indigenously owned, but occupied by our European settler populations some centuries ago. There are creative ways Canada could, if requested by Ethiopia, be of assistance. In Sri Lanka, for example, which is also a federation, and after the civil war that killed thousands, Canada contributed to the translation of a report on truth and reconciliation from Sinhalese to Tamil to help facilitate the participation of Tamils in the national discussion on truth and reconciliation constructively. In Northern Ireland, a former chief of the Canadian Defence Staff supervised the surrendering and destruction of arms and munitions used by previously violent hostile groups on both the Catholic and Protestant side, which followed upon the Good Friday Accord entered into by the United Kingdom, the Irish Republic, and their key communities in Northern Ireland in 1998. The United Nations mission to Ethiopia and Eritrea in 2000, just 2 decades ago, saw a Canadian military deployed to observe the ceasefire between the two countries, as happened for 3 decades between warring Turks and Greeks in Cyprus, with Canadian troops having been there for every one of the years of those 3 decades. How any outside country can be of genuine service to the Ethiopian people is what is hopefully a future, in what is hopefully a peaceful reconciliation and independent forensic review of events of the past few months is exclusively for the Ethiopian people and duly elected government to decide. Whether outside observers for upcoming elections would be of any value is also something for the Ethiopian government and parliament to decide. My point this afternoon is that federalism has within its essence ranges of flexibility and creative workarounds that can be genuinely helpful. Here at Queen's, we have always celebrated Dr. Ron Watts, a former principal of Queen's and a founding father of the Global Forum of the Federation and a scholar of world standing on federalism, who argued that, frankly, federalism was the best way to achieve measures of progress without serious conflict, violent or otherwise. That's what federalism allowed people to do together. Many parts of the world benefit from that federalist advantage, and many federations advance their people's interest well as a result of using the conflict avoidance instruments to advance their national interest. I'm delighted to listen to my colleagues and then take questions with the rest of them. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Honorable Hugh Siegel, for giving a talk whose title, unfortunately, I forgot to give everyone, and the talk was called Federal Government System in a Multicultural Society, Lessons from the Canadian Experience. The next talk is titled The Ethiopian State and Its Ethnic Publics, Towards Bridging the Gap. And the speaker is Professor Dada Barata. Professor Barata is a professor of anthropology, California State University in Sacramento, United States. His research interest is centered on understanding connections between identity, state power, and inequalities in the material conditions of multiple identity-bearing citizens. He has published extensively on contemporary issues in Ethiopia, including inequality and identity, ethnicity and cultural rights, land tenure and property rights, governance and social justice, conflicts and mediation and remediation. His most recent publication is his book entitled Contesting Inequality, Identity and Rights in Ethiopia, which was published by Routledge in 2018. And I'll turn it over to Professor Barata.
Thank you, Blair, and thank you, Jete, for the invitation. I feel honored to be part of this conversation. Can I possibly share my screen?
Sure. Go ahead, you can try now.
Thank you. Do you see it?
Yes, it's visible.
All right, sorry about the technical glitch already, but since the 15 minutes rule, I guess doesn't leave much space for anything, so let me get to it straight. Let me begin by explaining what is implied in the title of my talk. A few concepts are in there, but I won't muddle too much in there, but a few things need to be explained. So I am implying here that there is not just a shift. Historically, we know that the relationship between the center and Ethiopia's peripheries, or the central government and ethnic groups, has shifted. But I'm implying here that it's not just a shift, but a disconnect. And this disconnect has, in a way, led to the kind of violent experiences we are witnessing now. So then what I try to do here is at least try to answer that question: how can we better engage ethnic publics or the relationship between the Ethiopian state and ethnic publics. I'll in a minute explain what I mean by ethnic publics also. But for now, just take it loosely to mean anybody who has a feeling of belonging to an ethnic group and anybody who somehow feels like they need to do something about that relationship or when seeing anything wrong about the relationship between the Ethiopian state and their respective ethnic group. Let me also quickly provide what could be called a methodological disclosure in a sense, or just a note. I have been doing primary field research in Ethiopia since the late 1990s, over 20 years now. And these have been times of intense state remaking, reconstruction, nation rebuilding, ethnic violence, reform measures, and so forth and so forth. The last two visits of mine are especially notable here. I visited Hawassa after the violence primarily targeted the Walaita first in 2017, and then, 18, and then it obviously spread to affect everybody else in Hawassa and around. I also visited Gedio in 2019 after the violence against the Gedio and so forth. So there is some empirical first-hand observation notes based on those observations too. I also feel like I need to quickly mention, or at least provide some note on my positionality, so to speak. Here, I want to mention that just in case people who are out there knowing or who know me in sort of wearing different hats, I am, in my mind at least, actively participating. I am actively participating in various Ethiopian African diasporic communities or activities, including Vision Ethiopia, Association of Walaita and Allies in North America, Center for African Peace and Conflict Resolution. I am not representing any of those today, and I am not an activist by any measure of the imagination. Also, I was born and brought up in southern Ethiopia, and this is a very important part of my identity, and there is no point in denying the fact that that belonging does affect what I've got to say today, or generally my reading of Ethiopian history. But today I'm trying to take a scholarly approach to a somewhat contentious issue. All right, to the actual content of what I wanted to share with you today, the Ethiopian state. So the first part of the title. And so, as I understand, everybody knows that the Ethiopian state is under construction. I stole that title from a recent book of an anthropologist by the name of Daniel Maines, but he talks about construction in a narrower sense. But I here apply that concept to the entire state. The state itself is trying to rebuild, reinstitute itself. And here are a few sort of refreshers, so to speak, that is sort of reminders. I mean, these are, nothing new here, but a reading of history, for instance, of sorts. Here, Ethiopia has a long history, obviously, and windy history. But for today's comments of mine, I think these three bullet points might do. That is, up until 1991, that is the TPLF-led EPRDF violent overthrow of the Ethiopian government, the sort of foundational logic or founding or foundational ideology of the Ethiopian state was a notion or a cultural model of unity. But that unity did serve some purpose, but it also caused a lot of discontent. Obviously, there have been protests, revolts, and so forth. Finally, that state got overthrown. So then what followed it? That unity, to some extent, in fact, at the expense of suppressing any expression of diversity. So that obviously did not work for many. And then what did the TPLF-led EPRDF do? So on paper, the so-called ethnic federalism has so many interesting, in fact, logical, appealing principles and laws, but in practice, in reality, this was a thinly disguised ethnic authoritarianism through and through. By that, I mean, there is the federal center, but also its roots went down all the way to villages, and the federal or the party state chose or elected who came out as representative of the so-called ethnic federations. So people did not have a chance to pick who they wanted to represent them. So this obviously also, there was a point to which people could not take this, and so revolts, protests, and so forth, and TPLF-led EPRDF had to, in fact, has disintegrated now, or at least remodeled, minus TPLF. TPLF has now become a terrorist organization as of last week or 2 weeks ago. So now we have a new prime minister. The start of this new prime minister, or this new government led by Dr. Abiy Ahmed, it was a very promising start. The diaspora, usually a diverse and somewhat combative public, also came to support almost unanimously Abiy Ahmed. But then past the first 6 months or so, I think it is important that we give credit to very important measures he has taken, especially again at the beginning. But the reality on the ground has become increasingly harsh. The point here is not to take a broad brush and dismiss everything, as including, in fact, the pre-1991 pursuit of unity or federalism, or what's being pursued now as just a failure or a resounding success. It's very important to, or at least there's always that temptation. But some things are beyond contestation. All of this, in fact, these 3 bullet points all belong to a contested category. But what cannot be contested is that on the ground, there is violence and there is generalized insecurity. Now, what is the role of the ethnic factor, or what I am defining as the ethnic public? So a very obvious concept of my ethnic public here is that here are your ethnically organized federated states, so the Amhara and the Somali and the Oromo and the Afar and the Sidama now and so forth. These are the only, in fact, legally accepted states, and these are ethnically acknowledged states. But I refer to, so again, here I just wanted to throw in that concept of intersecting identities. Ethnicity is never pure here or elsewhere in many ways. It intersects with religious identities, other identities. Here, for instance, if you look at just for the sake of it, states like Afar and Somali, about 98-99% Muslim, and the states like Tigray and Amhara being about 90 plus, 85 plus being Christian, and Oromia being somewhat mixed and so forth. What I wanted to also imply here by this notion of ethnic publics is that this is a spectrum than a category, in a sense that it's an aspect of Ethiopian diversity. It's also itself. Every ethnic group has voices inside. What TPLF-led federalism did, including in parts where I did fieldwork, is that it silenced any voices within an ethnic group, and it picked representatives that would help it treat these ethnic groups as homogeneous. In theory, these are not, I wish I know how to translate Masvin Waldemariam saying in Amharic, meaning we members of ethnic groups are not like soaps or some kind of commodity produced in a factory. There are divergent thinkings within it. But also an aspect of it being ethnic publics is that this is also a space for pursuit of what Fukuyama might call recognition or dignity and so forth. In a sense, we cannot dismiss this. There are real issues that need to be addressed. But right now, probably the most destabilizing relationship or disconnect or relationship in disrepair is the relationship between the new Ethiopian state, Abiy Ahmed-led Ethiopian state, and the big 3 ethnic groups, the Amhara, Oromo, and Tigray. And this seems to be, it's an interesting time academically. It's a heartbreaking time as a person, especially a person of Ethiopian origin. What is it that they pursue? What is it that they are looking for? We did the title of this conversation implied, in fact, stated the notion of pursuing democracy or democratic government or governance. Is this really what they are fighting for, or is it really about power and resources, or just discontent and so forth? But also, Ethiopia is not constituted of just these three. In terms of violence, experiences of violence, injustice, in fact, the worst of injustices and violences are experienced historically. I mean, right now also this is happening in anywhere and everywhere, I would say, in the nation. There is generalized insecurity, I say. So these are also important to pay attention to. When Ethiopia is categorized as a somewhat fragile state, Center for Systemic Peace has a very useful data on that. But where do things stand now? There again, it cannot be contested that there is a heightened ethnic mobilization. There is also even more worrisome ethnic demonization, and that's happening not just at home in Ethiopia, but also in the diaspora. What can we do here? Let me see if I can see this. All right, so where can we go from here? There are no easy solutions, but there are some things we should know by now that we should not do. I wish I have a paper on, oh, I do have it. The fierce critic of African states, the economist George Aite recently wrote a piece entitled "The African Solution to Ethiopia's Civil War." And the way he ended that piece, and I'd encourage folks to, it does not mean I agree with everything he said, but the way he ended that piece should really enrage Ethiopians. Thank you. So he ends that piece. The wise learn from the mistakes of others, while fools repeat them. Idiots, on the other hand, repeat their own stupid mistakes. So our natural Ethiopian reaction could be, who are you calling idiots, Mr. Aite? We are not idiots. But I think we should be enraged by what we are doing. Many of the things we are doing at the state level, government level, activist level, and so forth, are things we have seen before during the time of Ethiopian revolution, the Ethiopian student movements. Many moving accounts are in there, winners and losers, and what constitutes winning and losing, and so forth. There are enough things, not enough mistakes not to make. I think we could come back to this, to specifics, if there is time during discussion. How can we, so there is, in fact, again, every ethnic group seems to be enraged right now. So we know that ethnicity as a form of identity has the power to energize people to be organized around certain things, except that our Ethiopian ethnic energies are spent on wrong projects, spent in really destructive ways. Can we possibly find ways of redirecting that energy to reimagine ways of coexisting and at least taking a look at what's going around in the world globally as well as regionally? In a sense, what I am suggesting here is that maybe, so dialogue, I guess, was the overall framework here. So maybe one thing we could look for is some kind of middle ground between what is sort of easily suggested as individual citizen-based democracy or democratic partisanship, governance, which is a great concept, but which is a troubled concept as well. Here, in fact, at home in the United States, Europe, Canada, again here too, that concept is being revisited. So we cannot do a whole-scale importing of that notion. But also the current ethnic federalism is not working. We do know that. So it seems like it's really high time to revisit all of that. also including re-examining what is meaning, or what is meant by winning and losing. And winners have always been more problem for Ethiopia than, in fact, losers, I would say. So I would suggest putting more pressure on folks who are refusing to talk because they think they are winning or they think they have won and so forth. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Many thanks, Professor Barata. I have the tough job of trying to cut people off in the time limits because of the fascinating talk. And I should note to the audience, it's important to, if you're interested in these ideas, not only to ask the questions, but to also reflect on the excellent papers and publications and YouTube videos of all the speakers, because there's lots of excellent work by my colleagues on the panel, which I think are speaking to this issue. Okay, I'm now going to turn to our next speaker. And the talk is going to be called Identity Politics and Ethnicity in Ethiopia, Gains, Challenges, and Fault Lines. It's by Dr. Tekelin Munguste. He's an assistant professor and chair of the social anthropology department at Addis Ababa University, and he is an affiliated researcher at Stockholm University in Sweden. He has widely researched and published on issues such as forced mobility, migration studies, social conflict, ethnic relations, and identity politics, focusing on Ethiopia and East Africa. He also conducted consultancy and policy research and has provided training on IDPs, internally displaced peoples management, migration governance, and conflict resolution for the Ethiopian government, for UN organizations, for the Swedish government, for the African Union, and other international organizations. He obtained his bachelor's degree in history from Addis Ababa University and his MA and PhD degrees in social anthropology from Stockholm University in Sweden. And now I'll turn it over to our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor and this generous and also the group for having me. I will go directly for the sake of time to my talks. As you mentioned, the title is a bit to the directly touching the issues. So identity politics and ethnicity in Ethiopia. If gains, there are some gains, challenges, and fault lines I'm going to talk about. Basically, my talks are based on not only my readings and research, but also from my lived experiences of this ethnicity, ethnic politics, and ethnic federalism during the last years. So I'm presenting based on my observations living in Ethiopia for the last years. So I'm explaining also the lived experiences of Ethiopians as a researcher and as an individual, how we feel and how we live the ethnic politics daily in Ethiopia. So it's not about only research, but also my lived experience I'm just reflecting today. So first I will just briefly introduce you about the perspectives of elites, educational elites, and also political elites toward this, their perspectives on ethnic politics in Ethiopia. Then I will just mention about some, gains, some merits about ethnic politics and ethnic federal structure in Ethiopia, because there is, this demonizations and also romanticizations of ethnic politics in Ethiopia. So I try to balance if there are some achievements have been made with this ethnic federalism, or is it all about failure and all about, bad things. So then I will talk about, mainly about the challenges, but also what are the fault lines, or what are the, the wrong turns that we took with ethnic federalism or this identity politics. And also finally, so to start with the elite perspectives on ethnic politics and ethnic federalism in Ethiopia, we do not have shared or common view on. There are different views on these things, but we can categorize, for the sake of understanding, there are two two views, two perspectives toward this ethnic federalism. One group is we can call them as harsh critics, or the critics, critical groups towards this identity politics and ethnic federalism. The second group we can call the pro or nationalists or pro ethnic federalists. So we can see their arguments and their debates and their points of discussions. That would help us, to better to zoom in to the current political conditions in Ethiopia. What are the debates and what are the daily life in everyday Ethiopia? So that if we view in this way, we can better understand. That's my approach. So when we see the views or the arguments of the harsh critics towards ethnic federalism in Ethiopia, be it politicians or academicians, the argument starts like this. The critics say that the very premise of ethnic federalism or ethno-nationalists were wrong, they say these critics toward this ethnic federalism. They say ethnic-based federal political arrangements are dangerous game. It has big potential for disintegrating the nation. It creates division and uneasy competition within society and opens door for extremists. It's not just idea of this pan-Ethiopianism or unity or Ethiopian identity is de-emphasized, but also it importantly ignored, lived shared Ethiopian identity and the social cohesion that existed for millennia in Ethiopia. So this is the critics. These critics also argue that this ethnic federalism or identity politics brings, the critics, bring their own evidence by saying that, for example, from the world, they say, hey, look at, the world, particularly post-colonial Africa experiences. Look at the civil war, the secessionist movements, and the resulting genocides, for example, in former Yugoslavia. And also they cite how this ethnic federalism cannot work. For example, how African countries or countries with federalism, such as Switzerland, Nigeria, and South Africa and Kenya, how they constitutionally banned being, establishing ethnic-based parties. So this is a harsh critic. When we come to the pro-nationalists, ethno-nationalists argue in Ethiopia that they strongly argue for existence of ethnic oppression. They cite sources. They say, see 1960 Ethiopian political struggle, nationalists, all the parties, including now the debates, as you can see. So they say in Ethiopia, in history, few languages and religion recognized, many minorities went to school. So this is the evidence of the existence of ethnic oppression or this kind of unequal or uneasy relations. So they say the problem in current ethnic federalism lies not on the ethnic federalism itself, rather it is because of lack of true democracy and a true federalism. That's why we are facing the problem. These are the ethno-nationalists' argument. So we can discuss, of course, how these two groups, what are the middle ground, what are the intersection points, how can we bring it middle? Some question is still going on and no one has found a solution. So if we, of course, honestly, if we review the last 20 years experience of ethnic federalism or ethnic politics in Ethiopia, still there are arguments, and his article recently published on ethnic-based federalism and ethnicity in Ethiopia, reassessing the experience, the experiment after 20 years. This is a very nice journal article that are being published. He also asserted this assumption that there are some gains that are achieved. It's not all about failure and all crisis, but there are some gains achieved during the last 17 to 20 years. One thing is, for example, repeatedly ethnic federal growth. Some say group rights respected, self-administrations exercised, people are developing For example, in schools and also public services, particularly in courts and the justice systems, people are using their languages. So this is one achievement federalism has brought. Some minorities and the powerless ethnic groups are recognized now. They are no more ashamed of their languages, their cultures. They also say beauty of diversity magnified, rediscovered. This is one achievement. Some argue. Self-esteem is and self-rule. The question of feeling of freedom among minorities are also increased. This is ethnic federalism has brought the achievements. Other thing was repeatedly mentioned was that mobilizing ethnic groups at times of disaster is increased. So be in diaspora or in homeland, whenever the disaster happens, each ethnic group mobilize their own resources. When something happened in Amara diaspora, Tigray diaspora, Harari diaspora, or also domestically. So the ethnic mobilization became easy achievement, some say. But when we come to the challenges, and not only challenges, my main point here is what are the fault lines, where we took the wrong turn, and why we are facing all this crisis is, I think, the most important issue we have to discuss, and we have to with this, I think. So the main challenge of this exercise, this experiment, that as a person, as an individual, I lived with this system for the last 20 years, is that the first thing is that we experienced and that we've seen is that the increased demand for, the first thing is, the increased demand for regions, zones, and woredas. There's this, every ethnic groups are looking for its own regions and structures. So this endless fragmentation of government structure, which is a big challenge. Pressure on the state for budget, admin challenge, wastage of time and the resource personnel. And another challenge is ignore shared identities, values, and the population that are established through years of population movement. Ethiopians have developed shared values and identities. These are being de-emphasized and become weaker. And this ethnic federalism on identity politics has caused also from mutual trust to mutual suspicion increased, tension, conflict, and lawlessness becoming high in the country because of extremists are pushing this agenda to their own direction. Nationalism and the nation projects were in greater danger, some argue, and the research also shows. Another challenge of this is that nationalist pan-Ethiopian thesis are resisted by ethno-nationalists. This is a big challenge actually. For some, if you see, if you follow the Ethiopian politics daily, for some, Emperor Melik II is one of the founding fathers of the nation. He is considered as like George Washington for the U.S. For others, he is like colonizer and he is like oppressor. So this divergent view on this big issue. Another, even we couldn't agree upon our flag, national flag. Some people doesn't want to see the Ethiopian flag. Other people are like loving the flag. So look at these things. So the core periphery narratives gained more currency by ethno-nationalists, compounded by unaddressed development needs, and divide the rule attempts by Italian occupation peoples, the ethno-nationalist movement. So this was actually the practiced long years before by Italian occupation. So this divide the rule system, which now TPLF repeated it again. So ethnicity has replaced nationality. Elite demanded ethnic homeland. Ethno-nationalists mobilized primordial approach to ethnicity. So they refeed ethnic identity as if it's only in the one identity. So every ethnic group claim ethnic oppressions. If you ask every ethnic group in Ethiopia, they say I'm explosive, I am oppressed. So no one is saying, we don't know who oppressed whom. So everyone is like saying oppressed. And I am more oppressed, they say. So what is then, who is oppressing? What is the solution? We don't know. So this is big challenge and demand for self-rule and a revival of culture rights and language Soviet groups that was emerging. But this is good, but togetherness and the unity was seriously challenged. And more importantly, discourses penetrated to use. So the younger group is hearing all these kinds of discourse from politicians, from academicians, from the media, from diaspora, like penetrating to the youth, and everyone is mobilizing them for their own purpose. That's why violence is increasing. Ethnic identity, ethnic homeland construction prevailed over Ethiopianness. Diversity and difference and uneasy relations among ethnic groups emphasized. If you see, this is by design actually for the last 20 years. If you look at Ethiopia, it is constitutionally, ideologically, through media and education. If you see school curriculums that we have been learning, maybe Professor Data and others, you never experienced this civic education that I went to, which is talking about how ethnic oppression was in Ethiopia, how the constitution was bad. Everything is about drifting and dividing. So narratives and terms were designated for some ethnic groups. The unionists called as chauvinists. Terms are given them, neftenya. All these dangerous terms are there and created, designed. Political programs and fictions are written. So all these things, okay, thank you. All these things were, has been produced. So ethnic extremism hampered life outside ethnic groups. So the unique challenges that experienced was the degradation of shared values that Ethiopians have, like fraternity, mutual trust, cooperation, sharing, patriotism, nationalism. These all Ethiopians built through millions, through years, thousands of years have been degraded. Power of religion, elders, customs of peace all became weak. Mistrust, violence, conflict, and displacement prevailed in the country. So why then all these things still prevail despite all the challenges? Of course, there is the demand from the constitutional provisions are there. Elites and actors needed this. For example, government structures, budget, employment position, projects. So it appeals. This ethnic politics appeals ethnic entrepreneurs, rent seekers, merchants, elites, unemployed users. So this is why it is still prevailing. A request for equality and development is there. People are looking for fast, accessible, and inclusive growth. Demand for prosperity is there. There's increased discourse or narratives about ethnic oppression. Because of this, it is still continuing. So what can be done? I mean, what is the point? So where is the middle ground? Maybe some points I can raise in terms of concluding. For example, I think the most important thing in Ethiopia we need is building trust between state and society. Trust is becoming a very important issue between ethnic groups and between the state and the society. It's like we are missing violence. Of course, we are experiencing all kinds of violence, symbolic, structural, physical violence. Combined state needs above with societal needs. Always politicians talk about, they know about the needs of society, but they never listen about the Ethiopians and the everyday citizens. So I think we have to revisit this kind of patternistic and top-down approach. We have to have also methods to design methods to come up with solutions. Finally, like last point is, so we have to move from competition to cooperation, flourishing together, and so emotion to reason. So we have to balance, between this emotion to reason, extremes to middle, and guided by knowledge and research and the principle rather than rumors. So rumors are ruining Ethiopia. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Munguste. It's an excellent presentation, raising lots of issues I'm sure we'll be discussing further in the discussion. I'm now going to turn to our fourth speaker. The talk is entitled The Economic Costs of Ethnic Federalism, Some Preliminary Thoughts. And I'm delighted to introduce the speaker, Professor Werku Abera, who's a professor of economics at Dawson College in Montreal. He is currently the chair of the economics department at Dawson. He completed his first degree at Haile Selassie University and the University of Guelph in Canada in economics and political science. He then received his MA and PhD degrees in economics from McGill University, specializing in development economics and international trade. His most recent research includes the political economy as a preferential trade agreement between Ethiopia and Eritrea and its economic consequences. He is also doing research on child labor in Ethiopia. And I'll turn to Professor Abera.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Redford. Hewitt, can I share my screen?
Yes, one moment.
Thank you.
Okay, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so Hewitt, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, thank you. All right, okay. I would like to thank the Ethiopian diaspora for peace, especially Shete, for inviting me to participate in this discussion. My topic is quite wide, and instead of giving you a lot of statistics about economic inefficiency in Ethiopia, what I would like to do is share with you a framework that will enable us, in my opinion, understand the causes and consequences of economic inefficiency in Ethiopia. First, let me try to define briefly what I mean by economic inefficiency. When you talk about economic inefficiency, what we're referring to is really, without being too technical about it, is an outcome that results in a wastage of resources. So intuitively, you can understand inefficiency as being wasteful. Economists definitely make the distinction between a number of types of economic inefficiencies, and these include productive inefficiency, sorry, allocative inefficiency, economic inefficiency, and distributive inefficiency. We could go into any of these in detail, but because of the limitation of time, I will not do that. So what you see is that when you look at all of these inefficiencies, they result in wastage of resources. So in my discussion, I'll also include social inefficiency, all right? So the question that we ask ourselves is really, what causes economic inefficiency? Well, when you look at economic inefficiency in any system, you see that economic inefficiencies are systemic. They are inherent in a system. There is no system that is free from economic inefficiency. Some systems are more efficient than others. For example, globally today, you have countries like Singapore, Denmark, and Switzerland that are quite efficient. On the other hand, when you look at countries in Africa, especially in Southern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, there is a lot of economic inefficiency. So in that sense, Ethiopia also shares that kind of inefficiency. But what I'm talking about in Ethiopia is a much more serious kind of inefficiency that we find in Ethiopia because of the system that we have. So when you look at inefficiency, as I said before, is every system has its inefficiency. The question here is how large, how widespread, how costly are these economic inefficiencies? And if we say that inefficiencies are systemic, well, to understand the root causes of inefficiencies, definitely we must understand the economic and political system. What this means is then, if we want to understand economic inefficiencies in Ethiopia, well, we must understand the kind of economic system that Professor Barata and Professor Takalin has been talking about. And specifically, whether we like it or not, we need to pose a question about the nature of the government that has been in power for the last 27 years. So a very simple fundamental question. What kind of government was the EPRDA for the TPLF government? When I pose this question, I'm not talking about the ideological orientation of the government, whether it is socialist or liberal, or the form of government, whether it is democratic or authoritarian. We know for a fact that the TPLF government has been a repressive government. There's no question about that. What I'm asking is an even more fundamental question about the nature of the TPLF government that has been in power for the last 3 decades almost. So the question I pose here is, was it a national government? Well, you may say, what do you mean by a national government? By a national government, I mean a government that is committed to, first, national unity. Second, the territorial integrity of Ethiopia. And third, the long-term well-being of all Ethiopians. So when we apply these three criteria to the TPLF government that was in power for the last 27 years, I'm afraid to say that it fails to qualify as a national government. And therefore, if we conclude that it was not a national government, so what kind of government was it? As I said, there are really a number of indicators that suggest that the TPLF government was not a national government. Because of time limitations, I'm not going to go into the details, but you don't have to listen to me. Just listen to what Getachew Radda said about a month ago on Al Jazeera. Just listen to Sayyid Abraham, who said about how the TPLF is fighting for independence on Tigray Media House. So there are serious questions about the TPLF's commitment to Ethiopia. Then if you say, look, if it's not a national government, what kind of government was it? We can say politely, it was a transitional government. A transitional government to what? Well, it's a transitional government that was preparing Tigray to be independent from Ethiopia. So the TPLF captured the state in 1991, but before that, it issued a manifesto in 1976 that declared that the TPLF was committed to creating the Republic of Tigray. None of the leaders, including Malla Zenawi, has renounced that manifesto. So we got to keep that in mind whenever we try to understand the economic inefficiency and its consequences for the economy. The other thing that the TPLF and the EPRDF have been saying is that they fancy themselves as a developmental state. Was the TPLF government a developmental government or state? Again, I have my doubts. If we say why? Well, because it lacks essential features of a developmental state. What are those features? First of all, you have to have a national vision to be called a developmental state. As was pointed out by two of my colleagues earlier, this was a government that was not committed to a national vision, but to an ethnic vision. Second, in order to have a developmental state, you have to have an independent bureaucracy that's dedicated for the long-term economic transformation and growth of the country. Whereas what we have in Ethiopia was a bureaucracy that was completely under the control of the TPLF. Third, the developmental state is committed to nurturing and helping develop a national private sector. As was pointed out earlier, the private sector was not national in nature, but it was based on the dominance of one ethnic group. And hence, again, this raises question about whether we had a national government in Ethiopia or not. Now, at the microeconomic level, the developmental state addresses market failures. Of course, you know, in economics, there are many market failures. But the emphasis or the justification for government intervention in the economy in developing countries is to address market failures due to transaction costs and coordination problems. That's the rationale. That's the justification for why the government should intervene in the economy. But when you look at the TPLF, what do we see? You see that, oops, sorry. that instead of addressing the transaction problems caused, the TPLF through its policy has in fact created so many transaction costs and coordination problems. You may say, can you give us an example? Here is a very good example. Let's look at cement production in Ethiopia. There was a cement factory that was government owned, located at Mugur, about 50 kilometers away from Addis Ababa. When the TPLF came to power, it did everything to undermine the viability of this factory. The quality of the cement deteriorated. The price level went up. At the same time, it was promoting Mesob, the company owned by the TPLF located in Mekelle. So what happened? If you're a contractor and you want to buy cement, now instead of buying it from Mugur, only 50 kilometers away from Addis Ababa, if you're a contractor located in Addis Ababa, now you have to import, you have to bring cement from Mekelle, 800 kilometers away. So you're increasing cost. So this is just one example of how the TPLF created transaction costs. Okay, the other characteristic of the TPLF is that it has high discount rates. Okay, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that the TPLF government economic policies emphasized short-term gains for itself at long-term costs for the Ethiopian people. Again, you may ask me, can you give us an example? Yes, there are many examples. An excellent example is the Karuturi debacle, where in 2008, the TPLF government agreed to allocate 300,000 hectares to Karuturi. This is an Indian agro-business company to engage in commercial farming in Gambella. Actually, it was the government that approached Karuturi, and they were quite surprised that they were given a very, very low rent for leasing land in Gambella. Can you imagine? At the price of 20 birr, less than $1.15 a hectare for 50 years. The company went to Gambella, cut down all the forests, desecrated religious sites, displaced the population, only paid starvation wages of 50 cents an hour to the workers. And finally, after embezzling millions of dollars from the Development Bank of Ethiopia, left the country. So this is, again, another example of creating transaction costs. Okay. So now, in order to understand assess the economic policies pursued by the TPLF government and how that creates inefficiencies, I want to share with you a little framework that I developed. So it starts with the ethnicization of the polity. As mentioned earlier, the emphasis has been on ethnicity and ethnicization. And as a result of that, the Ethiopian polity has been highly ethnicized. And therefore, in order to understand the policies of the TPLF government, we need to contextualize it within the ethnicized polity. So that leads to policies and resource transfer, including legal and illegal, which results in outcomes, economic, social, and political. And of course, these outcomes are deliberately designed to create the economic base, the social base, the political base for the independence of Tigray. So I call this grant preparation. So this creates inefficiencies. As Professor Barata was saying, it creates losers and winners. And of course, that tends to reinforce ethnicization, and the cycle continues. So for our Canadian friends, what this means is that it's like the Bloc Québécois, by some historical accident, becomes the government of Ethiopia, Canada, and then of course uses that position in order to further the separation of Quebec from Canada. All right, so I'll stop here for now, and if there are any comments or questions, I'll deal with that during the answer and question period. Thank you, Professor Rutherford.
Great, many thanks, Professor Abara, for a very rich presentation. Again, inviting lots of discussion, I'm sure, during the question and answer period. I'm now pleased to turn to our last speaker. Her talk is called Achieving Peace, Justice, and Development, Challenges and Opportunities in Ethiopia. And the speaker is Professor Anne Fitzgerald, who's the director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs and is a professor in Wilfrid Laurier University's Political Science Department. She has worked at both King's College London, University's Centre, London University Centre for Defence Studies and the International Policy Institute, as well as at Cranfield University. Her research focuses on national security and the governance of the security sector. She has extensive experience working in teaching, research and consultancy capacities in Ethiopia and in the wider Horn of Africa region, where she has also supported internationally sponsored peace talks. She served as course director for a UK graduate program delivered in East Africa between 2007 and 2019, and she has supported donor-funded research projects focused on security and justice. She's also a senior security justice advisor to the British government's stabilization unit. I now turn to Professor Fitzgerald.
Thank you very much, Blair, and thank you to the organizers for having me today. In the interest of time, I won't put up my presentation, and I'll just take out some snippets from it looking forward instead of backwards. I'm not an expert on federalism. I'm a professor of international security, but I've been asked to speak today about peace, development, and justice, the intersection of which is very important for federalism, and what is to be devolved and what is to stay at the center. So the first point I'd like to make concerns macro strategic frameworks. And this refers to what sort of Ethiopia do we want to see in 50 years to 100 years? And therefore, what is the next 10-year contribution to that? Broken down even further, what does that mean for a term in office for an administration? And I think this is the way we have to think these days, and to bring about policy and strategy frameworks that relate to this longer term vision. And we need to bring people together to give them the space required to think in such visionary terms. This should result in a roadmap, whether it's called a strategy and policy, whatever the name, doesn't matter, but the roadmap should be achievable and not aspirational. We've got many different national plans and national strategies around the world that are aspirational, that feature a laundry list of different things that a country would like, which a country preserves from its past and recycles. And those documents become completely unachievable. So these documents, achievable documents, are also important for national resilience, because Ethiopia has many partners that will wish to support the country and help the country moving forward. And it's important for leadership to be able to say, well, we have this strategy, we're very proud of it. Actually, we're very strong in this area, but we need some support in this aspect and over in this aspect. So it's important for resilience because it gives you the wherewithal to dictate the terms of support and the consolidated effort between both yourself as a country and allies. Macro strategic plans also need for you to shake yourself from the past a little bit as well. And that's not always an easy thing for countries to do. In many respects, and Hugh and I are looking at this issue now because we're doing some research on national security in Canada. We feel that Canada is a prisoner to its geography. We don't easily feel threatened, even after a global pandemic. The case of the United Kingdom is that one could argue it's a prisoner of its history, colonial empire, rule of Britannia, and now as a middle power, which has broken away from Britain, which is facing potential breakaways internally, it needs to focus on being a strong middle power. So what does Ethiopia have to break away from in the past? Is it, does it concern ideology? And one could argue that Moderator was an effort to try to break away from that ideologically based policy past, but without a strategy and roadmap to implement those aspects of Moderator, some of the principles of Moderator risked getting lost. So let's turn to justice as one of those elements that I've been asked to speak about. I think the question here is, what is just? What is fair? What is equitable? What are those important democratic principles that we expect everybody in a country to have knowledge of, let alone knowledge of the measures that they can access to defend those democratic rights? And I would put forward the argument that I don't think that's the case yet in Ethiopia, having worked in outerlying areas such as with the Dizi and the Surma tribes. Some communities still have a view that security, a very important concept within the Constitution, is equal to intelligence. There are other groups who would see the word development, another important word in the Constitution, as something that led them to being kicked off their land. So when we talk about capacity building, in an urban sense, it is very different to the same sort of capacity building needed in a country in the peripheral areas. And this is really important for nation building, to bring along a country together, holding hands, bringing them forward, and not uneven development of strong urban centers, weak periphery, etc. We've lived with that in the past in Ethiopia. And also, nation building doesn't mean stirring everybody up in a big pot, which has been a strategy, I would argue, pursued by other countries in the Western world. But it means identifying shared common values, shared interests, and allowing people to identify with those shared interests and values, albeit preserving those very, very special things that they have at the community level. Witness the customary court system in Ethiopia and special traditions across the Amhara region, Sidama, Gada system. These have worked very well. People identify with them. But in parallel to that, we need legitimate state functions as well. So perhaps we should not be talking about Ethiopianness, because there's supporters of that concept, there's detractors of that concept, but talk about an Ethiopian approach to nation building. Truth is a very important driver and outcome of fairness and justice. And sadly, it appears that recently we've had some issues with truth and truth-telling and evidence-based truth. And truth is an important aspect of a country's history as well. It goes without saying that we're not fans of all the leaders that we've had in our lives, but at the end of the day, they're an important part of history, and their record must be embraced and must be recorded. Truth commissions, I won't talk about what Hugh's talked about already, but we've seen some very competent and productive truth commissions work around the world. They've brought good outcomes. They've worked with religious leaders and local authorities. But justice moving forward will require good accountability as well. Democracy is a non-negotiable concept. You can't have a little bit of rule of law or a lot of rule of law in some places and not in others. So when somebody breaks the law, there's an expectation that they will be held to an account in a fair, equitable, and reasonable way. So this shows the legitimacy of the state. And civil society plays an important role in this accountability. And without breaking all challenges down for Ethiopian civil society moving forward, I think something that will continue to plague all of us in the world, including Ethiopia, is the veracity and authenticity of data and information. And in this context, the international community has a lot of catch up to play, and the ground-based reality is outstripping the pace of policy. So it's important for national governments to grab hold of this through the help of their civil societies and bring some measures into place that can evaluate information in the future, information that is passed down to the population. A few quick words on development. Professor Worku went over the developmental state model. Development's important for bringing opportunities to youth, developing society, but I think there's a big requirement to acknowledge the shortcomings of the developmental state model. In fact, there was no clear-cut model. It was, in my view, an amalgam of bits from Singapore, bits from Taiwan, bits from the South Korean experience, and it was a wait and see how it played out. And fundamental to that model are three things: a strong state strategy, the availability of financing, and a population whose basic services are met. The model's also been tried in relatively homogeneous populations. Ethiopia is a highly diverse, in some areas divisive society, and the transferability is very weak. But there are aspects of the model that we've now locked into a little bit in parallel with liberalized market reforms. And these have to be addressed in the context of China's deepening footprint and the predatory finance model underpinning its Belt and Road aspirations, a model which has driven several African countries to already be on the brink of collapse, like Zambia. Security is the last thing that I'll talk about. Security forces are institutions for the people, not for a party. They can have their individual preferences, but it is a non-partisan institution. And we've seen the development of a non-constitutional security apparatus, which has been allowed to grow in a very unsustainable way, a way which sees lines of loyalty being directed towards regional presidents instead of the center. And as soon as there's a difference between what a region thinks of a situation and the center thinks of a situation, there's grounds for war and conflict because of those different lines of authority and management. And this is not akin to any other security sector that I've worked with during my career. The current structure also leaves the regional police very weak and constantly in search of capacity and a purpose. And that shouldn't be the case. The regional police should have supremacy for law and order at the regional level. So widespread reform is required for the security sector. And I think we have to accept that this will require a lot of investment, support for the creation of alternative livelihoods, transitioning, etc. So I think I'll just finish there and leave the audience with a few key messages. The importance of establishing the necessary means to provide truthful narratives and to sustain truthful and evidence-based narratives in the future. The concept of appropriate nation building, an Ethiopian sense of nation building that can be developed for the country, a well-informed strategic framework to go with any ideological ideas or principle-based vision that prioritizes certain areas in line with where the country sees itself going in 50 years. And I think we've got to make bold choices around our priorities because you can't do everything. So you've got to say, we see ourselves being this in 50 years, our contribution over the next 4 years will be A, B, and C, and stick to that and dive deeply into it. Underpinned by the appropriate constitutional reforms that will provide the enabling framework. The dismantling of regional security sectors and perhaps the development of a National Guard type concept answerable to both regional states and to the center, but with limits on the use of manpower, weapons, etc., and the use of those weapons. And lastly, a hybrid model of what works with the developmental state building approach and what can address the foreign direct investment strategies pursued by countries like China that only exacerbate issues concerning capital flight and reduced ability for foreign exchange. And just very, very generally, a country needs to be economically prosperous to be predictable. It needs to be predictable to attract foreign direct investment. Without being prosperous, it won't be secure, and without being secure, it won't be sovereign. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Many thanks, Professor Fitzgerald, and especially leading us to kind of looking forward thinking as we get into the question and answer period. I ask all the speakers to please turn on your video. For the question and answer period, some questions have already been coming in. I'm going to bunch a few of them together and pose them to the panelists, and then I'll ask each panelist to speak in turn to any of the questions, if any, they would wish to. And I'm going to start with asking kind of more general questions that have emerged. The first one is kind of looking at the Ethiopian ethnic federal state as a system. How do you compare it to other federal systems? A second question is, how can federalism unite us rather than divide us? Does TPLF use the question of the national question up to secession to prolong their power and divide and rule tactics by dominating other groups? And the third question for this round is someone who observes that they were quite surprised no one is mentioning anything good that came out of federalism in Ethiopia, especially in creating decentralization in the administration and in the provision of services. They ask the presenters to say a few words on the positive side of the federal system in Ethiopia. I think what I'll do, I'll start with our first speaker. I'll ask everyone to try to keep their responses for a few minutes so we have time for more questions. And of course, if other speakers have questions or comments on the other presentations, also we can get into that. So I'll start with Hugh, if you don't mind.
Well, generally, one has to give federalism credit, the Ethiopian brand of federalism credit, for being the basis for the formation and sustaining of a national state at the end of the Marxist regime. Without that kind of federalism, maintaining any kind of coherence would have been very, very difficult. That being said, it is a kind of federalism that is unique to Ethiopia. And that is because the sociology and politics of Ethiopia is unique to that country and its culture. I would argue, though, that there are other federal innovations that have existed elsewhere, which may be of value to various authorities in Ethiopia as they plan the future. For example, one of the methodologies that has been used in some federations has been what is referred to as executive federalism. What that means is that you put together, for example, a particular organization that has within it representatives of all the different parts of the federation with a particular purpose. A purpose like, for example, expanding trade, or a purpose like improving the quality of education, or a purpose like truth and reconciliation. So the authority is established by the different organizations within the country, but the purpose is pursued centrally. Nothing is violated in terms of the existing constitution, but the ability to work together is perhaps for a period that is sunsetted for a period of 3 to 5 years, established by the authorities within the existing federation, which allows sometimes a more coherent approach, providing there is, of course, the goodwill and the cooperative spirit, which makes it possible.
Great, many thanks, Hugh. Dada, do you want to jump in?
Sorry, I was muted. Maybe I'll quickly comment on the third question, whether there's anything positive about the federal system. it is difficult to talk about anything positive now and back in the day when it seemed to be working, at least towards the, I cannot say the end of it in a way. That is during the times of the so-called double-digit growth and so forth, at least in economic terms, it seems to have been working. But speaking kind of ethnographically about it, that is based on what I observed, what I heard on the ground in the South, for instance, this was a very meaningful move. Much of it remained symbolic, but some of it was in fact real. For example, court systems that adopted local languages. These were very important for ordinary persons, for example. Also, systems that seemed to acknowledge, recognize at least some kind of recognition of some pains, some I think that the proper term would be structural violence from past systems of governance. It seemed to have offered some kind of recognition, and many people appreciated that. Obviously, beyond those generally symbolic, and some, like I said, are practical, but the pains it brought down, but also the way it silenced any voices, even down at the village level, so to speak. So at the end of the day, the practice in principle is seemed great. At some things, in fact, I did try to highlight that the temptation to take that broad brush and dismiss everything. And then, of course, the proponents of the federal system think that this worked for everybody. It did not. It did not work even for the majority, but not everything is lost. There were a few things that we probably need to revisit and probably even maintain. I think as a principle, federalism should stay in a sense, but needs some serious revisiting.
Great, thank you, Brada. Tekelin, please.
Yes, I would comment on the second question: how can federalism unite us or divide us? And as briefly on that, the third issue that Data was responding, is there some positive thing there? Yeah, to start with, is this federalism only the tool for TPLF, or is there something which has an element which recognizes the Ethiopian reality and some kind of unity can be maintained? I think for me the most important thing is, I think, the misuse and the fault lines of this ethnic federalism by TPLF was a problem. Otherwise, I think it took wrong turn by design. Constitutionally, if you see the Ethiopian Constitution, Article 39, and also all the definitions in the Constitution, all the ideologies and the political programs, the school curriculums, how they used and misused ethnic federalism is main problems and the federalism itself, I think, for me. So by design, they took a wrong turn, and like, of course, they used for divide and rule, or whatever term you can use. That's why we are facing these things. So otherwise, we could have there are positive things, there are opportunities. Of course, to answer the third question with this, there are positive things and there are positive achievements, in fact, with ethnic federalism. Of course, some minorities have, started to self-rule with all the problems, with all the limitations. And of course, cultures and festivals, for example, some cultural events and festivals as registered in UNESCO. Look at Chambalala, for example, in Sidama, which is, UNESCO has recognized, registered this, and people began to exercise their languages and their cultures and learn their languages. We can't dismiss everything, but of course, when it comes to the costs we are paying and the wrong turns we took and the misuse of it for political purpose by TPLF, of course, it's a disaster. And that's why it took a wrong turn. So for me, it's like the fault lines are very important, so that we have to find out those fault lines and redirect this to right direction, and balancing between ethno-nationalism and the pan-Ethiopianism is an issue, I think, for me, and there is possibility there. If we truly to look at, and of course, for truth and reconciliation, and looking at and revisiting these things, of course, we can add upon, and we can still maintain federalism, and there is no wrong about that. Thank you. I stop here.
Great. Many thanks, Tekling. Worku, please.
Okay, thank you. I think there may be some misunderstanding. When people are criticizing ethnic federalism, it doesn't mean that they're criticizing federalism as a form of government. In fact, when you look at the general tendency, this is outside my field, is that even among unitary states, there is a movement towards devolution. When you look at, for example, England, the UK, or Spain, there is an attempt to share power with the local regional governments so that people will not feel alienated. So the idea of a federal state, a federal form of government for Ethiopia is very, very appealing. Given Ethiopia's geographic diversity, its ethnic diversity, religious diversity, and so on, it makes sense to have a federal form of state. The problem with the TPLF style of ethnic federalism is the fact that, as was mentioned earlier, the emphasis on ethnicity and the de-emphasis on shared values, shared history, shared experiences. And so what it is that when you look at the setup of the administrative units, as was pointed out by Professor Barata, you don't have a homogeneous regional group. I mean, Ethiopians are mixed. As you mentioned, even in places like Afar and Somali, there are Ethiopians of different origin. So in fact, what we really see is that it's not ethnic federalism, it's ethnicized federalism. Why I say that is, as mentioned many, many times, in Ethiopia, there are many different ethnic groups. So if you're really serious about having ethnic federalism, since Ethiopia has something like 80 ethnic groups, should you have 80 different states? So there is a problem there, right? At the same time, what you see is that it was really an arbitrary form of ethnic federalism that was imposed on the Ethiopian people by the TPLF. So how can you justify, for example, a small ethnic group like the Harari having their own state when you have other ethnic groups that count in millions? Until recently, the Sidama, the Walaita, the Gurage, that are numbering millions, and yet they don't have their own ethnic states. So the whole purpose, one really questions the project, what was it for? So it looks like really it was to ensure that the TPLF stays in power, to ensure that there's going to be transfer of resources and so on. At the same time, the problem that ethnic federalism as practiced by the TPLF has is that it is really, when you look at its form, it is authoritarian, right? As the result of that, you don't have really much autonomy. In fact, when you look at the regional governments, they are very much controlled by the central government. At the same time, what's very, very upsetting is that minorities don't have any rights. And in fact, the regional constitution, the constitutions of the regional governments explicitly discriminate against certain ethnic groups. For example, in the region of Benishangul, the majority ethnic group are Amharas. And yet, very specifically, the regional constitution says that no other group except indigenous groups, the way they define it, will have the right to form government. And hence, minorities are not represented in the regional governments. They're not represented in the security apparatus and so on. And therefore, that has contributed to a great deal, in my opinion, to the kind of political instability and problem that we have today. Okay, thank you. I'll stop here.
Many thanks, Urku. Anne, please.
On that last question, I would say that, yeah, there was one thing that I thought worked well, but was completely countered by something else that needed change, constitutional change. From a security perspective, that was the way in which government central provisions could be called upon in security so easily. And we call it military assistance to the civil authorities. But the problem was when those civil authorities in the region had direct loyalty to the regional system, there were too many question marks that loomed that questioned whether or not forces in the region would step down and allow the central forces to come in and take over. I mean, the other thing that worked well is the fact that Ethiopia did in 2002 develop its own national security and foreign affairs policy and strategy. And there was a lot conflated there, not just national security and foreign affairs, but policy and strategy. But that's okay. It seemed to work. And I think the problem was that it was very outdated by even 2010, let alone 2015. And it was based on a strategic environment that had not existed for a long time. So even though it was one of the first African countries, Ethiopia, to develop its own homegrown macro strategic framework, it was never updated and kept green. So, I mean, I could go on and talk about a number of aspects that worked in a security context, but which were also undermined by other things that didn't work.
Great. Many thanks, Anne. I'm going to now turn to a second round. I'm going to draw on some of the questions which were directed to specific speakers, but I'm going to again give a number of them just as I'm looking at our time here. So please take note of which questions are directed to you, and then I'll turn to you. So there's a couple questions directed to Professor Barata. I'm going to kind of paraphrase. In the absence of a common vision among political elites as to which direction the country should head to, what do you think is the best way forward to avert a looming disintegration of the country and bring about a lasting peace and democracy to Ethiopia? Another question to Professor Data is, how does mixed federalism work, especially when there are more than 80 ethnic groups in Ethiopia? Ethnic administration has to be mixed with what type of administration, and how can it be determined? Then a question to Dr. Tekelin. Don't you think those who claim ethno-nationalism are also grand ethno-nationalists themselves, who want to dominate and dominate others through assimilation under the disguise of Ethiopianism? Are all ethno-nationalists, according to my observation, they're using different techniques? What do you think? Also, what is the polling factor for the Tigrayans to create a republic? It also has to be a conspiracy. If there's no pushing factor, there's no justification for secessionist movement. For me, poverty is what is fueling our politics, and identity politics is distracting us from the root cause. What do you think? Another question to Professor Tekelin. Do you believe there was no ethnic-based inequality in Ethiopia before or after the TPLF government? If so, what is the way forward? And then Professor Worku and Professor Fitzgerald, is the existing constitution the basis for the failure of federalism in Ethiopia? Do you think provincial federalism would be an alternative to ethnic federalism? And then just a comment to Professor Worku. They were also dumping the market with Mesobo to bankrupt Mujer and thereby to control the market. So I'm going to turn to Dada, if you want to kind of respond to the questions, and we'll go through the rest, please. Thank you.
Thank you. These are really great questions, and there are no easy answers. I can only share some thoughts. For example, the way forward. In order to suggest the way forward, we have to agree on the diagnosis of the problem. What is the problem? And the immediate context now is this federal system that is put in place by TPLF/EPRDF, and it looks like, it feels like. Now we can read the constitution literally, but also it's never, what meets the eye is one thing, but there is so much that is hidden behind it. There's so much bad faith assumption and so forth. But if for some reason we grant a good faith assumption, the principle, what we can read, what any person like, for instance, Blair, who is, say, not an Ethiopianist, reads the constitution, there are principles that can be workable. But also we know that system has left winners and losers, and the winners, so to speak, want to hold on to whatever victory they think they won. So two things, again, I don't want to take too much time. There is the principle. I think Abi's Medemmer idea, for instance, there's a great deal of principle in terms of at least striking a balance between these diverse publics and maintaining the national unity. I think we should agree that Ethiopia needs to continue as a nation. Now, if we can somehow agree on sort of minimal or share some minimal good faith that people in these other categories, whether they are ethno-nationalists or the so-called nationalists or unionists, they may have a point, although that point is different. So then in that regard, principles should be fairly workable, easy enough to put together. In other words, the need to amend the constitution, for instance. Even the American constitution has been amended for so many times. It's 27 times now, or since we have 27 amendments and so forth. So those folks who tend to argue that this constitution is untouchable, no constitution should be untouchable, in a sense that we have to revise it to respond to the current situation. What worries me more than agreeing on principle is the practice. Even, I mean, in the times of Medemmer, we see that the practice falls way short of what is promised. So as long as we can find out a way of practicing, I mean, some notion of fairness. Ethiopia has so many sort of traditional or African philosophical thoughts, grounds about fairness and negotiation and striking a deal and so forth. Never like, this notion of winner taking all has not been part of, I mean, historically at least. Of course, the national state always tends to take, at least in our history, winners take all. But since the TPLF time, that practice became even more rugged or more naked, I would say. Could mixed federalism work? I cannot claim to be an expert on federalism, but one thing I can comment quickly is that if federalism is meant to address the challenge of diversity, the Ethiopian federalism, even in principle, seems to have picked up or elevated just one aspect of diversity. Ethnicity is one aspect of diversity. Now I feel the need to include other aspects, also regionalism and any other that works without threatening the autonomy now, or at least quasi-autonomy, or at least psychological, symbolic autonomy, many of these ethnic groups who, or at least the ones who have their own regional states, enjoy. And it should be possible to work out a revision or a revision that incorporates these other publics or diverse interests and ideas.
Great, many thanks for being nice and concise, addressing these heavy issues. I now turn to Tekaleen, please.
Okay, thank you. There are some questions to me. I mean, in terms of unionists and also the ethno-nationalists, so the question implies like both groups have their own kind of disguises and this critique. I fully understand these things, but of course when we say ethno-nationalists and unionists, they might not call themselves in that way, but it's like academic literature which categorizes for the sake of understanding. We call ethno-nationalists, those who are, ethnic-based parties, and in history we have also this is very clear. So, but I think this is very tricky thing. But from the ethno-nationalist perspective, it's very clear. They clearly argue that the ethnic oppression was there, and then now, first thing is of course group right, and then of course individual rights should count. This kind of arguments the ethno-nationalist is clearly presenting, but those who are claiming for union and also for pan-Ethiopianism is very clear. I mean, these all critics they brought is like based on the every way. So so the reality tells us, the experiences tells us, the lived experience, how we lived this ethnic federalism, ethnic politics, identity politics, how it is used, by whom, what are the misuses, what are the wrong turns, and what we experience. The cost we paid is very clear. So that's why this is like now we have experienced it now more than 20 years. So as I mentioned, so it's not about unionists or about nationalists, so it's not about the dividing line. Rather, what we gained and what we lost is very important. I think we have to rephrase the question so that what is the lived experience, the results are very clear. Therefore, so what is the working thing? What are the way forward? What should we do? Is the most important question for me than blaming the unionists or blaming or appreciating the Ethiopian nationalists. So in Ethiopian politics, you can every day see that one demonizes the other, and there's romanticization. Both sides there's problem. There's both sides extremism is obviously there, and the politics is there played out. There are different actors in Ethiopian politics. Many actors are misusing, and abusing these narratives. So the most important thing is how Ethiopians are experiencing this, how this is shaping the conflict, the displacement, the sufferings of Ethiopian citizens are very important. So we are paying the cost. So we can create words, arguments, all these kinds of analysis can work, but can explain somehow academic exercise, intellectual exercise, but on the ground people are paying the cost. So I think it's better to explain from the daily lived experience, as Data was saying, ethnographically. That's very important than when we are explaining this is ethnic federalism, this is this kind of federalism, this is that kind of federalism. But in reality, what kind of life Ethiopians lived with this? This is very important for me. Of course, when it comes to the issue of ethnic equalities and whether is there ethnic exploitation or ethnic inequality exist before and after, do you think this question came to me like that? So of course, I mentioned in the presentation at the beginning, there is this research which shows that some kind of marginalization and some kind of experiences by design or by default, some groups have been, the history tells us some kind of, some ethnic groups have been, if you are from certain groups, you have to change your name when you go to school. That's true. And when you go to urban area, you have to change your name. That's Ethiopian experience. We can't deny these things. But we should also be careful that there is no one ethnic group which is concretely sits there and exploit Mr. Y ethnic group. And history doesn't show that. So that's we can argue for days on this. This is one of the main dividing line. Is there ethnic oppression or class oppression in history? What kind of oppression? Which ethnic group is oppressing whom? We don't have such if you read the history, at least my reading is, there is no such ethnic group sits there and like organize and go to the certain area and exploit. Maybe the different narratives there. So there are Marxist perspectives, there are other scholars who are criticizing this. The debate's going on. So, but there are some realities that certain ethnic groups, certain minorities have their own lived experience and exclusionists, and maybe it's by design or by default or how it happened. We can argue for that, but there is some kind of point there. So in Ethiopia, the main problem is no one listens to the other side of the argument. For example, unionists never approach and to try to listen those who are saying that we are exploited, we are abused, we have the point. No one is listening to each other. The main problem in Ethiopia is like that. So Ethiopia is a unionist is blaming the international, the nationalists blaming you are unionist, you are like assimilating, and everyone is blaming each other. So no one is trying to take the shoes of the others and try to listen to the pains of the other. So that's the main point in Ethiopia. So might have each group have their own arguments and their own points. That's truth and reconciliation. That's the negotiation. That's the discussion we need in Ethiopia. So I think that is the point. Otherwise, we can argue. We have evidence in both sides.
Great. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Many thanks, Declan. I recognize we should be wrapping up now, but we'll give a few extra minutes if the speakers have patience to Worku and then Anne to respond to the questions. I turn to Worku, please. Worku.
Okay, thank you, Brad. All right, I'll be brief in the interest of time. Regarding secession and independence, we should keep in mind that it has always been the project of the elite and never of the masses. It doesn't matter whether you look at, let's say, separation in Quebec or in Spain or in Ethiopia, it has been really motivated by the elite to gain power. So it's not different. It's not different from this what takes place in Tigray. So when you look at it, the Tigrayan people, there can be no more Ethiopian than the Tigrayan people. But the TPLF has its own agenda, and in fact, the reason that it had to retreat from pushing independence during its struggle was because the Tigrayan people rejected it outright, that they don't want to be independent. They were saying, look, if we're going to be leaving Ethiopia, well, what's left? So they will not accept it. And of course, economically, it will be quite disastrous for Tigray, just as the separation of Eritrea from Ethiopia had adverse economic consequences. Okay, regarding ethnic federalism, it's not sustainable. It does not work. It will not work. Even for those who are advocating it in the long run, it will not work. Imagine what's going to happen. If you're going to have, let's say, maintain the current existing ethnic federalism, where most of the resources are under one region, Oromia, and if we're to look at the political alliance to stay in power, all Oromo politicians have to do is ally with one or ethnic group, and they can stay in power for perpetuity, for a long time. So this can create the problem of majoritarianism, where the majority can win all the time. Therefore, it needs to be reformed. Otherwise, it's not sustainable. Small minorities, including Tigrayans, can be excluded from power forever. So this was the kind of problem that Nigeria faced when it started. There were, I believe, 4 or 5 states, and then they realized that that kind of administrative structure will lead to permanent absence of certain minority groups. So they had to divide it up, I believe, into 36 units or so. So it has to change. Regarding the constitution, definitely, I strongly believe that it has to change, because it does not take into account minority rights. According to the Constitution, sovereign right lies within nations and nationalities. Therefore, a regional government can come up with anything to discriminate against minorities, and that can be considered legal. So that cannot be sustainable. It has to change. Regarding productivity, definitely you need to have private ownership of agriculture. Even in a country like Vietnam, they introduced more or less private ownership of land, and as a result of that, productivity increased significantly. What's interesting about Vietnam is that in just about 5-10 years, Vietnam, that did not produce coffee, became the second largest producer of coffee because of the reform in land ownership. Therefore, definitely, if you want to increase productivity, there has to be an introduction of private ownership. However, it doesn't mean that there is no role for cooperatives or government ownership of agricultural land. Definitely, you can have a combination of these three in order to tap into Ethiopia's huge resource for economic transformation. Thanks.
Great, many thanks, Worku. Anne, please.
Just very quickly, I want to pick up on a point that Werku mentioned, that ethnic federalism is not sustainable. And I totally agree with this, because ethnic federalism will always produce victors and vanquished, and will be taking productive time to deal with the vanquished until we have a new set of victors come in. And that's not a productive trajectory for the country in general. Somebody asked in the questions whether or not the provincial federalism model would work. I think it would. I still believe in federalism for Ethiopia, and I believe that's the right pathway. It would allow for asymmetric federalist measures to be put in place and give flexibility where flexibility needs to preserve what works in particular regions. I also think that before we even move to a new model and constitutional amendments, the national dialogue, in whatever form that ends up taking, I mean, a lot of mechanisms are already in place supporting national dialogue and a national reconciliation commission. But I think we need to think about the outputs of a national dialogue. What is it that we want, and what do we want to use? And I think to be able to use them to inform the national interests of the country, that gives everybody an overhang and something that can be used to support nation building as well. What are those fundamental principles that everybody subscribes to as an Ethiopian citizen? And somebody in the question said, talk about where nation building in this context has worked before. And I'll highlight the case of Indonesia, which came out of a pre-Suharto era of communal violence across many of its 1900 islands, 1900 plus islands, biggest Muslim country in the world, but it didn't feel that it had come together as a nation. And so it started talking about all those things that meant a lot to every individual citizen, and came up with 5 new national interests: one almighty God, unity but diversity, social justice, political democracy, and one more that I'm forgetting. But anyway, then policy became based on that, but that held the society together. There were music, pop music, a national anthem type of song that was developed based on this concept of national interests, called panacea, which in Bahasa means the 5 values. And I think simple things like this could fall out of the dialogue process and then provide that basis for moving forward with national policies, provincial policies, informing the constitutional amendments which need to come. But these sort of things can outlive political change as well. And I think that's what we need. We need anchors in place, like a good constitution that can support a good provincial federalism model, and good principles and foundations that support nation building.
Wonderful. Many thanks, Anne. I turn to Hugh to see if you have final thoughts. There are no specific questions directed to you, but of course you have much knowledge and experience.
Only to say that federalism takes the form of the society it's seeking to serve. So there is no way, nor is there any appropriate way, to impose federalism of one country upon the culture or society of another. It also means that every society has to figure out how to shape federalism in its own interest. And I think that history argues that for our Ethiopian brothers and sisters, this is an opportunity that can be very constructive in the future.
Wonderful. Many thanks, and warm thanks to all the panelists. It was fantastic presentations and a really rich dialogue. And thank you to the audience members for all the great questions. Unfortunately, we couldn't have them all addressed, but you know, the interest in discussing these and debating these and thinking through them is, you know, shows some promise, even though it's, you know, lots of sad and tragic events are going in Ethiopia, and of course, as we've heard, and no, passions are quite strong. I want to give a warm thanks also to the Ethiopian Diaspora for Peace for hosting this panel and bringing everyone together. And I'm going to turn to Haywat Hadonom to say some closing words. Thank you.
Thank you, Blair, and thank you to all the panelists for sharing your thoughts with us today and taking the time out of your day to be here. So I'd just like to highlight maybe one point from each of your presentations before closing up for today. So from the Honorable Hugh Siegel, we heard, he highlighted rather, the hallmark of Canada's federalism, which is the asymmetric federalism, which allows provinces to tailor their policies and practices to their provincial realities, as long as, of course, they align with the public interest and respect the jurisdiction entrusted to them through the constitutions. He also mentioned a few mechanisms that are available through federalism that various governments in Canada have used to resolve governance challenges which may be relevant to the Ethiopian context. Dr. Barata went on to highlight the complexity of ethnic identity and cautioned us against making the same mistakes we've already made in the past, focusing on the winner-take-all attitude. He also encouraged us to redirect the outrage many of us experience due to current events towards finding creative solutions to these complex challenges that continue to face Ethiopia. Dr. Ayalo mentioned that although there have been some gains made under the ethnic federalism, most notably the access to services in local languages, the example of the court system was highlighted by Dr. Barata. We must critically look at the cost of such gains, such as the increased tension, violence, weakness of the sense of shared value, and of course, the loss of trust. He also encouraged us to really focus on the lived experience of Ethiopians rather than just the theory of these systems of governance that are proposed. Dr. Barata offered a framework that can, Dr. Aberra offered a framework that can help us understand the economic costs and the economic inefficiencies that have resulted from the ethnic federalist state of Ethiopia under the EPRDF. He also challenged us to really reconsider the notion of the EPRDF as a national government and its claim of being a developmental state, keeping in mind the marked absences of key markers of developmental states, such as independent bureaucracy and the national private sector. Dr. Anne Fitzgerald shared her thoughts on a wide range of things, and one that really struck with me was the idea of moving away from talking and discussing issues under the banner of Ethiopianness, but rather moving towards an Ethiopian approach to nation building, which may decrease some of the tensions that come with using terms like Ethiopianness. So on behalf of the Ethiopian Diaspora for Peace, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. And a special thank you to Dr. Blair Rutherford for moderating this discussion for us. We know these are not easy concepts or ideas to discuss, especially in the current climate of Ethiopia and in the climate of the various diaspora communities around the globe. We appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise and knowledge with us on this platform. And we also want to thank all of our participants on Zoom as well as Facebook for joining us. We welcome you to share, we welcome all your ideas that you may have for topics that you'd like us to discuss on this platform or guests you'd like us to feature. Thank you once again, and you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and via email. I will share our contact information in the chat right now. Thank you, everybody, and have a fantastic week. Take care and take care of each other.
Okay, take care, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks very much. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.